Hi, welcome to the bathtub, where when you hear this sound effect, and you see this masturbator, and you see this glass of pure mountain spring water, and no pixels in sight, you know this is the post-tech bathtub short story roundabout. It's everything. It's all there. We've got it all going in the same show. And I've had to film this twice. So somebody, I'm not going to say their name, has quieted down a bit. I had to cut this off before I strangled her a few minutes ago. And that's it. We're going to try to do a short story roundabout. One of the things I'd like to talk about is the fun part of doing short story roundabouts is just kind of mixing 2 or 3 short story writers together. Because when you read one short story collection all the way through, sometimes it's great, but sometimes there's a lot happening in a short story, and good short story writers demand a certain level of attention that you're not always capable of giving them. And also, they're so different. The styles of short story writers are so different. I think they're much different than novelists. That's my personal feeling. So anyway, there's a lot of different things I'm half saying there. But I often find that my opinions of short stories change very quickly. And I may be in the right mood for a story, and the first halfway through the book I'm kind of enjoying it, then I kind of lose interest, blah, blah. Anyways. So anyway, this is a reassessment roundabout. Roundabout is a reference. This is for our UK friends, where they call roundabouts instead of merry-go-rounds, I think. 3 or 4 months ago, when I did one of the early short story roundabouts, I talked about the first volume of G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown stories. And I sort of dismissed it a bit. I liked reading the first half of this book. I was reading it in conjunction with other mystery writers. And I tried reading him many years ago. I tried reading the Father Brown stories. And many of you may not have read him. G.K. Chesterton was a very Catholic writer. He's a very, very religious man. And he's was a big influence. I mean, R.A. Lafferty, some of our friends are big R.A. Lafferty fans. R.A. Lafferty was a big admirer of G.K. Chesterton. And that's about all I know about him. He wrote some interesting criticism as well. He was a critic and he was a novelist. He wrote some weird fantasy. I mean, very weird Lafferty-like crazy fantasy. All filled with a kind of undercurrent of Catholic attitudes, I guess you could say. And that's the way you might think of this is basically, I thought it was Sherlock Holmes in a priest outfit. That's how I thought these stories were going to be. They're going to be very similar to Sherlock Holmes. And every time I read them, they're not at all like Sherlock Holmes. They're very different. They're very, I didn't, the first time I read about halfway through this was a few months ago, and I almost didn't think I'd finish the book. And then it's been sitting on my side table for ages. I thought, well, I should try to finish through the first volume of The Innocence of Father Brown. This is the first of 4 or 5 collections that G.K. Chesterton published. And the second half of the book, I had a great time. I literally couldn't put it down. I sat down, I was on the sofa over there, and I read one story after another, which I remember doing the first time I read Sherlock Holmes stories years ago. Pure mountain water. Cruel light of day. And I had a great time. So that's all I can say is if I sort of dismissive of the Father Brown stories in the last one, I wanted to say I'll correct that. What they are is they're mysteries, but they're very contrived mysteries, even more so than Sherlock Holmes, in the sense that this priest always seems to wander into these they're always like locked room type mysteries, things where something horrible happens and it's impossible to have happened. I mean, there's one where he's at a dinner party this is one I can't remember too well, and someone gets their head chopped off and thrown off the building or something like that. And each of the murders is really contrived and controlled, and Father Brown has to go in there, and we've got this already. Okay, just in case this little booger starts to interrupt me again. Father Brown keeps getting in there, and he's always figures out the whole mystery. Now, one of the things that's important about it is that he says very often, that this this world, there's a lot of kind of sort of a commentary on the inability of the world to really live up to what's beyond the world. There's bits of commentary like that. And there's one story that I really liked a lot called The Eye of Apollo. And I think I remember that well enough to give a halfway accurate summary, which is where there's a guy who has a religious, he has some sort of religious cult. And he's in this building, and some of our apartment building. And every day he comes out onto his balcony and he's prays to, is it the Eye of Apollo and the sun? I can't remember now, but he has some sort of prayer he gives out loud, and everyone goes watches him. And in this same building, there's these two ladies who I can't remember their relationships already, but they have, he's got them connected. He's got a deal with them where he's going to get them to leave them all his money when they die or something like that. Anyway, at one point, one of the women dies just as she's writing her will. It's a totally contrived story, but somehow there's often people are murdered when the murderer's not in the room. They figure some way of murdering somebody while they're not there. If you read the stories simply as murder mysteries, I don't think you really enjoy them because they're totally contrived. What's kind of fun is that this little priest guy keeps showing up in places. And they're like parables. They're kind of like parables of people who are like, for example, this guy's blinded by the sunlight of the world rather than thinking of something more eternal, of truth, or what's right, what's wrong. And that's a quick summary. Anyway, at one point, the prophet is talking to Father Brown. It's kind of an interesting picture of these two different personalities. And he calls him, this guy calls himself the prophet. He says, "Your church and mine are the only realities on this earth. I adore the sun, and you the darkening of the sun. I enjoy life, you enjoy what's past life after you're dead. You are the priest of the dying, and I of the living God. Your present work of suspicion and slander is worthy of your coat and creed. All your church is but a black police. You are only spies and detectives seeking to tear from men confessions of guilt, whether by treachery or torture. You would convict men of crime. I would convict them of innocence. You would convince them of sin. I would convince them of virtue." So in the middle of the story, Chesterton gives this opinion of basically someone who's more of a pantheist, who believes life is really itself beautiful, and then this priest who says, well, life is not. Life is the lie, and when we die, we go somewhere better. Anyway, it's a very simplistic reading of it, but there's some sort of a very complicated, very well-written parable in the middle of these stories. And you don't have to be a Catholic. I'm far from a Catholic. Dodo might be a Catholic. But you don't need to be religious, but there's something about just a beautiful way he puts these stories together, and the prose is really good. Chesterton is actually a very good writer. So anyway, I had a really surprisingly good time with the second half of The Innocence of Father Brown, and I've even bought some of the later volumes to read them as well. Here's another example. Nabokov's Dozen, Nabokov. We have mixed feelings about Nabokov here. We love some of his books. Some of his books we find kind of annoying. Some of his books take several readings before, like Pale Fire, before they actually reward those readings. Sometimes the damn stories are just too clever. You want to say something to me? Okay, it's all right. I don't mind. As long as she's quiet, I don't mind. So I have mixed feelings. There's a lot of people who you can't have mixed feelings. You just have to love Nabokov, and the rest of us don't deserve to be in the same ballpark as him. But I don't believe that. I do love some of his work, and sometimes I find him very difficult and annoying. Anyway, I'm reading through this book of stories, Nabokov's Dozen, and I keep going in and out of these stories. Sometimes I like them, sometimes I don't. Even when I like them, sometimes I find them a little too clever, too controlled. But some of the stories I liked a lot. And about 2/3 of the way through it, I decided I'm going to go back and reread some of those early stories, which I've read. Many of them I've read in the past, and I forget them. But, for example, there's one called Signs and Symbols. I read that a few weeks ago. I really like go back and forth. Signs and Symbols about an old. A lot of these stories were written during the war in the 40s, when Nabokov and what were they often called White Russians, I believe, people who left Russia and for Europe and for Berlin, where Nabokov lived for a long time, and he talks about these people and their political opinions. They're meeting with people who are supporters of the Bolsheviks and people who aren't, and a lot of the politics of all these emigres comes up into the parties and the stories that he tells of these people. Anyway, the story Signs and Symbols is about an old couple who go visit their son who's mentally ill, and he sees signs and everything. He sees the world as somehow hostile to him because he reads the cloud that passes in the sky as like a fence against him or somebody looking down at him. And he looks at everything that way, and he's terrified of the world and wants to kill himself. It's quite a sad story. And then you go home from that institution where they meet this, where they can't see the kid because he's actually trying to kill himself. And the parents go through this kind of weird, it's like a fugue or a little bit of a reflection on all of this. And there's a kind of a connection with the notion that all writers make the world in a fictional story as if it's this kid's experience, right? When you tell a story and you write a novel, if a cloud passes across the sky, it could be symbolic of something. So Nabokov likes to put you in these games where you're sort of seeing a story and the world is being made for you by some writer, etc., etc. Anyway, it kind of annoyed me, and then on reflection, I liked it more. There's a funny story called A Forgotten Poet, which is kind of a perfect Nabokov story, which is a bunch of people go to a party and they're talking about, it's like a Kafka type character, someone who died young years ago, and he's become very celebrated. And in the course of the party, some little old guy shows up who says, "I am that poet. I didn't die. I'm still alive." And everyone's really uncomfortable with him because they would much rather treat him as this vanished person. And there's another story called The Aurelian, which I liked, which is, again, they're all about people who kind of live fantasy lives. And it's about an old man who wants to be who loves butterflies. And he's been collecting butterflies from other collectors. He's never been able to travel around the world and see these butterflies for himself. Now, Nabokov was a big butterfly lover, big butterfly collector. Okay, you're gonna have to go again. Oh my God! And I don't know if it's ever going to get any better. It seems to be getting worse. Anyway, it's an interesting story. I don't want to tell the ending. But like I said, I got about 2/3 of the way through it. I felt like some of the stories I wasn't focusing as much as I should have. And I didn't enjoy it as much as I enjoyed the Chesterton. So I'm surprised. That's basically when I pick up short story writers. I'm always surprised, especially when I'm in their zone and when I'm not. The third book I read, I actually completed this. I'd always meant to read it. It's called The Rose. It's by a guy named Charles L. Harness. It was a book. They call it a novel, but it's like a short novel of about 80 pages. It was originally published in 1953, I believe, in a British magazine. There's an introduction to this volume. See, isn't that cool? I kind of want a lot of these books I just keep and read because I love the covers. These old Berkeley medallion science fiction covers were just beautiful. These are weird stories, and he had a kind of cult reputation particularly in England, and he had trouble publishing his stuff in America. And I believe he was a lawyer who lived in Texas. Only in science fiction you get all these odd characters. And he published a work over there. There's a nice introduction by Michael Moorcock, who was a big fan of this book. And he helped get it back in print in the late 60s. And there's 3 stories in it, 2 novellas and 1 very short story, which frankly that's the one I got into the most. I found him interesting. It's very Van Voghtian, kind of futuristic, weird future cultures. They're much more controlled and better written than Van Vogt. Let's try this again. And they often have something to the idea that our perceptions of reality are constitute reality. He's one of the few science fiction writers I can think of who talks a lot about Kant and Kantian, that perception of the world and how we categorize our perceptions and so forth. Anyway, I found the Rose was interesting. The basic premise was that art sees more into the reality of the world than science does, And there's always often in both of the major stories in this, there's a kind of weird Van Votian bad guys with guns running around, and the secret police are in there. I forget what happens in the Rose, but there's some sort of weird kind of police melodrama in the middle of the story. And the new reality, the science, science fiction is about science. The scientists in that are ontologists, people who understand the reality of the world. And the premise of that one is that the world's reality is shaped by our knowledge of the world. So, for example, when we know about other planets and other outside of ours, those planets come into existence. We create the reality through human perceptions, and it's only human perceptions that do this. Anyway, that leads into a kind of a weird melodrama with guns, as I recall. But they were interesting. I liked them. I probably will try reading a little more Charles Harness, but I don't know if I would have read it if I hadn't seen that lovely cover for years on my shelf and knew Michael Moorcock liked it. Finally, I'm ending this really quick. I went on too long because I'm battling a stupid bird. I actually read, talk about waste, the complete third volume. Look at the size of this. I read 3 volumes of Legion of Superheroes. I'm sorry, from the 50s and the 60s. And all I can say is I kind of enjoyed reading them again. They had a huge effect on my 7-year-old brain. I have no idea I don't think it was a good influence, but perhaps it was. And I reread them, and they're kind of fun. And for some reason, I just want to keep reading them. They're just ridiculous. Anyway, these are kind of nice volumes. Jim Shooter was the one who became a big guy at Marvel and DC or wherever he is now. And he was a young kid writing a lot of these. They're pretty wild and weird stories. And at the end of the book, the Legion of Superheroes were big, popular comics when I was a kid. And then they became unpopular. And they were relegated to supporting stories in the back of Superboy or something. They're all 8 or 10 stories, 10 pages. And they're kind of ridiculous, but I kind of enjoyed the short ones. I don't know why. I have any idea. But I kept reading it. I don't know why that is. Okay, Dodo, now Dodo doesn't want to come down. She's back in her thing. And I'm sorry that was such a complete waste of time. I would really recommend all of these books for different reasons to be put on your short story roundabout. Take care. I'm going to do another quick one. Bye.